The icy rain masked her tears as she collapsed against the heavy iron gates. She had walked for 3 days to escape her uncle's cruel bargain. When the doors finally opened, the feared Duke looked down at her, his dark eyes reading the dangerous secret she carried. The damp air of the London townhouse clung to Elara Vance like a heavy weight. She sat at the edge of her narrow bed, pulling her dark woolen shawl tightly across her chest. It was the only possession she had left of her mother, and she wore it like a shield against the harsh reality of her life. At 28, her hazel eyes held a quiet sadness, and her delicate features were pale from exhaustion. For 3 long years, since her beloved father passed away, she had been a prisoner in this house. Her uncle, a man who valued social standing far above his own family, controlled every aspect of her existence. Elara knew her father had left a will. He had promised she would be cared for, that she would have a modest income to live peacefully, but that crucial document had conveniently vanished the very day he died. Her uncle simply claimed there was nothing left but massive debts. Now, those debts were demanding to be paid. The creditors were knocking louder every day, and her uncle had found a terrible way to erase his ruin: Lord Silas. The name alone made Elara hold her shawl even tighter. He was a wealthy, older man with cruel eyes and a reputation that frightened everyone in society. He had offered to clear her uncle's debts completely, but in exchange, he demanded a young, obedient bride. When Elara had bravely refused the arrangement, her uncle had simply smiled a cold smile and mentioned the private asylum on the grim edge of the city. He calmly explained that a few coins given to the right doctor would easily prove she was mentally unfit for society. The choice he laid before her was clear and terrifying. She could accept a marriage to a ruthless monster, or she could lose her freedom behind locked iron doors. 200 miles away, the freezing rain howled across the moors of Yorkshire, beating violently against the thick stone walls of Pendelton Manor. Inside the grand library, Duke Arthur Pendelton stood perfectly straight by the crackling fire. He looked out the tall glass window into the darkness, his sharp gray eyes reflecting nothing but the desolate night. He slowly turned the heavy silver signet ring on his finger. It was a constant habit he relied on whenever the immense weight of his title felt too heavy to carry. At 38, Arthur was known across England as a severe, unyielding man. Society whispered that his heart was made of the same unforgiving stone as his ancient manor. They feared his authority and his uncompromising nature. People kept their distance, intimidated by his imposing figure and perfectly maintained posture, but the society gossips did not know the truth behind his cold mask. Arthur actively embraced the isolation. It was the only way he knew how to protect his family's fragile legacy. Years ago, his younger brother had made a foolish, dangerous mistake, getting deeply involved in a treasonous plot against the crown. To save the family name from ruin, Arthur had handled the situation quietly, carrying the dangerous secret alone. He had chosen duty over his own happiness. Now, he trusted no one. He managed his vast lands with absolute control, building an invisible wall around himself. He truly believed a quiet, lonely life was the price he had to pay for honor. Back in London, the grandfather clock in the dark hallway struck midnight. Elara sat perfectly still on her bed. A floorboard creaked right outside her door, followed by the low murmur of voices. Her uncle was speaking with someone in the study down the hall. Driven by a sharp instinct, she crept barefoot to the door and pressed her ear against the cold wood. "The papers are fully prepared," her uncle said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "Lord Silas will bring the carriage tomorrow evening. She will sign the marriage contract, and my debts will be erased forever." "And if she refuses to sign?" a lawyer asked quietly. "Then the carriage will take her straight to the asylum," her uncle replied. "Either way, I am finally done with her by tomorrow night." Elara stepped back, her hand covering her mouth. She had less than 24 hours. If she stayed in this house, her life was entirely over. Frantic, she dropped to her knees and pulled a small wooden box from under her bed. It held her father's personal letters. the only things she had managed to hide from her uncle. She sorted through the aged papers with shaking hands until she found exactly what she was looking for. It was a faded letter from an old friend of her father, thanking him profoundly for a life-saving favor. The elegant wax seal belonged to the powerful Pendelton family of Yorkshire. It was a desperate long shot, based on a forgotten debt of gratitude from years ago, but it was her only chance at safety. Elara packed a single, worn bag with a change of clothes and a hard loaf of bread. She wrapped her dark shawl securely around her shoulders. The heavy rain was beginning to fall outside, masking the sound of the back door slowly opening. Without looking back, Elara stepped out into the freezing London night, turning her face toward the harsh northern roads. The journey north was a blur of freezing rain and constant, quiet terror. Elara traveled mainly on foot, hiding in the shadows whenever a carriage rattled past on the muddy roads. She knew her uncle would not let her go easily, and that Lord Silas was already searching for her. The thought of his cruel eyes and the threat of the locked asylum kept her moving forward, long after her feet went numb. She traded her silver locket for a ride in a farmer's wagon, huddling under damp hay to stay out of sight. Every sudden noise made her heart race with panic. She barely slept, resting only in short bursts under large trees. The single loaf of bread she brought was gone by the second morning. By the time she reached the open moors of Yorkshire, she was running entirely on desperate willpower. The northern wind bit through her clothes, but she kept her dark woolen shawl wrapped tightly around herself, holding on to the faint hope of safety. On the evening of the third day, a terrible ice storm swept across the hills, bringing heavy sheets of freezing rain. Elara stumbled along the rocky path, her vision blurring from hunger and deep exhaustion. Just as she felt she could not take another single step, a massive stone wall emerged from the heavy fog. Following the wall, she finally saw the towering iron gates. They stood before her, intricate and intimidating, blocking the entrance to the grand estate. She reached out, her frozen fingers wrapping around the cold iron bars. She tried to call out, but her voice was lost in the howling wind. Her knees buckled. She could no longer support her own weight. Elara slid down against the gate, the cold metal biting into her back. The world around her started to spin. She pressed her face against the iron, closing her eyes as the heavy rain soaked through her clothes. She had finally reached her destination, but she was completely shut out in the storm. Inside the quiet warmth of the manor, Duke Arthur Pendelton sat at his massive oak desk. He was reviewing estate ledgers, enjoying the deep silence of the house. Suddenly, the deep, urgent barking of his estate dogs echoed from the courtyard. He frowned, setting his pen down. Visitors never came to Pendelton Manor without notice, and certainly never in the middle of a brutal ice storm. He walked to the window, but the fog was too thick to see the main gates. Ignoring his butler's offer to send a footman, Arthur grabbed a heavy wool coat and strode out the heavy oak doors himself. The wind immediately whipped his dark hair back as he walked firmly toward the commotion. He expected to find a lost traveler or a broken carriage. What he found made him stop completely in his tracks. A small figure was crumpled on the ground just outside the gates. Arthur quickly unlatched the heavy iron doors and pushed them open against the wind. He knelt down in the freezing mud. It was a woman. She was soaked to the bone, shivering violently, and clutching a dark shawl as if it were the only thing keeping her alive. Arthur gently brushed a wet strand of copper-brown hair from her face. Her delicate, heart-shaped face was pale, but when she slowly opened her eyes, Arthur was struck by the intensity in them. Even in her weakest moment, her hazel eyes held a spark of quiet defiance. She did not look away from him. She looked up at his stern features and the heavy silver ring on his hand. "Duke Pendelton," she whispered, her voice trembling but surprisingly clear. "You are safe now. Do not try to speak," Arthur said softly, his deep voice carrying a rare warmth. He noticed how tightly she held herself, recognizing the deeply ingrained posture of someone used to being on the defensive. Elara shook her head weakly, fighting the heavy fog clouding her mind. She reached out with a trembling hand, her fingers brushing the dark wool of his coat. "Please," she breathed out, "do not send me back. They will take me." Before Arthur could ask who was pursuing her, Elara's hand slipped from his coat. She fell completely unconscious in his arms. For a long moment, Arthur simply stayed there in the rain, holding her. He was a man who avoided entanglements, building walls to keep the world away. But feeling how fragile she was, and remembering the absolute desperation in her plea, the cold barrier he had maintained for years finally cracked. He did not call for the servants. He carefully gathered Elara into his arms, lifting her against his chest to shield her from the biting wind. As he carried her through the courtyard and toward the warm, brightly lit doors of the manor, Arthur looked down at her pale face. He did not know her name or what dangers she fled. He only knew she had risked everything to reach his door. His jaw set with quiet determination. Whoever they were, whatever they wanted with her, he made a silent vow. No one would ever take her from his protection. Elara woke to the gentle crackling of a fireplace and the comforting scent of lavender. A kind older woman introduced herself as Mrs. Higgins, the Duke's housekeeper. For 3 days, Elara stayed in the quiet room, recovering her strength. She was completely exhausted, but the soft linen and the warmth of the fire slowly brought color back to her cheeks. For the first time since her father died, she felt entirely safe. Duke Arthur Pendelton visited only briefly, standing respectfully near the door. He asked no difficult questions, simply ensuring she had everything she needed. His severe face rarely changed expression, but his deep voice carried a quiet reassurance that made her racing heart slow down. The fragile peace did not last. On her 4th day at the manor, Elara felt strong enough to walk downstairs. She stood by the parlor windows, looking at the sweeping moors. Suddenly, the harsh crunch of carriage wheels broke the silence. Elara looked out and felt the blood drain from her face. Stepping out of a dark carriage was her uncle, followed by the menacing figure of Lord Silas. Behind them stood 2 local authorities wearing the uniforms of county constables. Cold panic gripped Elara. She stumbled backward as the nightmare found her. Her heart hammered wildly against her ribs, the terrifying memory of her uncle's threats returning in full force. Before she could run, the parlor door opened and Arthur walked in. He saw her terrified face and immediately looked out the window. His jaw tightened as he assessed the men approaching. He walked smoothly over to Elara, placing himself between her and the window. "Stay behind me," Arthur said firmly. "Do not say a word. I will handle this." The heavy front doors of the manor were opened by the butler, and the uninvited guests marched into the grand entry hall. Arthur stepped out of the parlor, his posture projecting absolute intimidating authority. Elara hovered anxiously in the doorway, her hands trembling as she watched. "Duke Pendelton," her uncle said smoothly, holding up a thick stack of papers. "I apologize for the intrusion. We have come to retrieve my niece, Elara Vance. She is a deeply troubled young woman who has run away from her medical care." "She is resting in my home," Arthur replied, his voice dangerously calm. "She will not be leaving." Her uncle smiled coldly. "She must, Your Grace. I hold signed medical documents proving she is mentally unfit. She is a danger to herself and must be taken to a secure facility immediately. If you refuse to release her, you will be harboring a fugitive. The resulting scandal will destroy your pristine reputation in society." Lord Silas stepped forward, eager to claim his prize. Arthur stood perfectly still. He turned the heavy silver signet ring on his finger, his mind working quickly. He knew the law perfectly. If he challenged the forged medical papers in court, it would take months. In the meantime, the authorities would legally force Elara back into her uncle's custody. Once she was behind the locked doors of the asylum, she would be lost forever. He could not let that happen. Arthur stopped turning his ring. He looked directly into the greedy eyes of her uncle and stood taller, his presence completely dominating the large hall. "You are gravely mistaken," Arthur said, his voice ringing with absolute finality. "Your documents hold no power here. You cannot take Elara Vance anywhere, nor does she require your medical facilities." "And why is that?" her uncle demanded, his confident smile faltering. "Because she is no longer under your guardianship," Arthur stated clearly, looking briefly back at Elara before facing the men again. "By the ancient laws of our peerage, a woman's legal protection transfers entirely upon her formal betrothal. Miss Vance is my contracted fiancée, and the future Duchess of Pendelton." A stunned silence fell over the grand hall. Elara gasped softly, her eyes widening in absolute shock. Her uncle turned red with anger, realizing he had been completely outmaneuvered. The local constables immediately stepped back, suddenly terrified of offending a powerful duke. Lord Silas glared at Arthur with pure hatred, but even he knew he could not challenge a man of Arthur's immense standing. "This is a lie," her uncle hissed, gripping his papers tightly. "I will be watching you, Your Grace. If I find any proof that this engagement is false, I will return with the magistrate." He turned abruptly and stormed out the door, taking Lord Silas and the authorities with him. When the heavy doors finally closed, the silence in the hall was deafening. Arthur turned slowly to face Elara. She was gripping the doorframe, trying to process what had just happened. He had saved her, but the price was a massive, binding lie. "I am sorry for acting without your permission," Arthur said softly, closing the distance between them. It was the only legal way to instantly invalidate his claim. "What happens now?" Elara asked, her voice shaking slightly as she looked up at his imposing figure. "Now we must live the lie," Arthur replied, his gray eyes full of quiet determination. "You are safe under my roof, but we must convince the servants and the society that our engagement is real. You cannot leave the estate without me as your escort. If you step off my lands alone, your uncle's papers become valid again, and I will not be able to stop him." Elara looked at the severe, powerful man standing before her. He had risked his own flawless reputation to protect a stranger. She gave a small, resolute nod. She pressed her dark woolen shawl against her chest, drawing comfort from its familiar texture. She knew she was trading one form of captivity for another, but this time her protector was a man of honor. They were now bound together by necessity, trapped in an agreement that neither of them had expected, but one they both had to survive. The first weeks of their arrangement were defined by a careful, polite distance. Elara expected Arthur to demand some kind of payment for his protection, or to control her days exactly as her uncle had done. Instead, he treated her with absolute respect. He provided her with a comfortable, sunny room, fine meals, and the complete freedom to wander the vast halls of the manor. Yet he remained a solitary figure. He took his meals quickly and spent his long days managing his extensive lands. Elara watched him from afar, seeing the heavy burden of responsibility he carried on his broad shoulders. She realized he was a man who gave everything to his duty, leaving nothing for himself. One rainy afternoon, the quiet of the large house became too much for her. Elara wandered into the grand library, seeking the comfort of books. She found Arthur sitting at his massive oak desk, surrounded by tall stacks of estate ledgers and local maps. He looked deeply tired, rubbing his temples as he read a complicated report. Elara hesitated in the doorway, clutching her old dark shawl tightly against her chest. "May I help you, Your Grace?" she asked softly. Arthur looked up, surprised by the interruption. He usually preferred to work entirely alone, guarding his privacy fiercely. "These are just the quarterly accounts, Miss Vance. It is very tedious work. I would not want to bore you." "I am not easily bored," Elara replied, taking a step into the room. "My father taught me how to read financial records before he passed away. I would be glad to organize the files while you review the numbers." Arthur studied her face for a long moment. He saw a genuine desire to be useful, a deep need to earn her place in his home. He slowly nodded and pointed to a comfortable wooden chair across from him. For the rest of the afternoon, they worked in a peaceful silence. The only sounds were the scratching of his pen and the soft rustle of paper as Elara neatly sorted the documents. It was a simple, quiet task, but it built a small bridge of trust between them. As the weeks passed, Elara noticed how meticulously he managed everything. He cared deeply for his tenant farmers, ensuring they had enough coal and wheat for the coming winter. She realized the fearsome Duke was actually a man of hidden compassion. As they worked together in the library each day, they exchanged brief comments about the weather or the estate. These small conversations slowly melted the ice between them. Elara began to look forward to their afternoons. It was the first time in years she felt her mind was truly valued. Despite the growing warmth indoors, Elara still carried her dark woolen shawl everywhere. She held it tightly against her chest whenever she walked through the halls, treating it like a physical barrier between herself and the world. Arthur noticed this habit. He saw the defensive posture she always maintained, a clear reminder of the fear she had lived with for so long. One crisp morning, Arthur asked Elara to meet him in the morning room. When she arrived, she found him standing by a large table. Resting on the polished wood was a beautifully wrapped box. Elara stopped near the door, her hands instinctively tightening around her old shawl. "You have a package, Miss Vance," Arthur said gently, his gray eyes unreadable but very soft. Elara walked forward cautiously. She untied the ribbon and lifted the lid. Inside lay a magnificent cloak made of heavy, rich emerald wool, lined with the softest dark velvet. It was practical for the harsh Yorkshire winters, but undeniably elegant. She touched the fine fabric, completely overwhelmed by the generous gift. "I cannot accept this, Your Grace," Elara whispered, looking down at the floor. "It is far too expensive. You have already given me so much protection." Arthur closed the distance between them, stopping just a few steps away to give her space. "It is entirely necessary for the northern winds, and more importantly," he paused, his voice dropping to a low, comforting tone, "I want you to know that you are safe under my roof. You do not need to defend yourself here, Elara. You do not need to wear your armor anymore." Hearing him say her first name sent a warm wave through her heart. Elara looked up, tears springing to her hazel eyes. She saw no pity in his expression, only a quiet, steady support. Slowly, with trembling hands, she let her old shawl slide from her shoulders. Arthur gently picked up the new emerald cloak and draped it around her. The heavy, warm fabric settled over her like a protective embrace. For the first time in her life, she felt truly cared for. As the days turned into months, their formal distance transformed into a genuine partnership. Elara learned to read his subtle moods. She noticed that whenever Arthur faced a difficult decision, he would silently turn the heavy silver signet ring on his right hand. Late one evening, the manor was completely silent. Elara was walking back to her room when she saw a line of light under the study door. She pushed it open slightly and saw Arthur standing by the fireplace. He was staring into the flames, turning his ring with a tense, rhythmic motion. Without a word, Elara went to the kitchen. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a silver tray with a pot of hot tea and 2 cups. Arthur looked up as she entered. "You should be resting, Elara. It is very late." "So should you," she replied gently, setting the tray on a small table. She poured a clear cup and handed it to him. "You are turning your ring again. What is troubling your mind?" Arthur sighed, accepting the warm cup. He was not used to sharing his burdens, but the gentle concern in her eyes made it impossible to push her away. "It is a legal matter regarding the eastern farms. A neighboring landowner is trying to claim a portion of the water rights. If he succeeds, my tenants will not have enough water for the spring planting. The ancient deeds are completely unclear." Elara sat down in a leather chair, thinking carefully. "My father dealt with a similar dispute when I was young. Instead of fighting over the old deeds, he proposed a shared reservoir system, funded jointly, but managed by a neutral party. It saved both estates from ruinous legal fees and protected the farmers." Arthur looked at her in surprise. The solution was brilliant in its simplicity. It protected his people while avoiding a bitter public conflict. He set his cup down and smiled. It was a rare, genuine smile that completely transformed his severe face, making him look years younger. "You are quite remarkable, Elara," he said softly. "You have just solved a problem that has kept me awake for 3 nights." Elara felt a deep blush rise to her cheeks. She realized then that she was no longer just a refugee hiding in his house. She was becoming a true part of his life, and he was becoming the center of hers. Their peaceful routine was abruptly interrupted a week later by an elegant envelope arriving in the morning mail. It was an invitation to a grand dinner party hosted by Lord and Lady Harrington, the most influential couple in the county. If Elara and Arthur wanted society to believe their engagement was real, they had to attend. The evening of the party, Elara wore a beautiful, modest gown of deep blue silk that Arthur had ordered for her. When she walked down the grand staircase, Arthur was waiting at the bottom. He wore a perfectly tailored dark suit. When he looked up and saw her, he stopped breathing for a moment. He offered his arm, his eyes reflecting a deep, silent admiration. The Harrington estate was brightly lit and filled with the local aristocracy. When Arthur and Elara entered the ballroom, the music seemed to quiet down. Whispers followed them everywhere. Elara kept her head high, but her heart raced. She squeezed Arthur's arm, and he immediately placed his other hand over hers, offering silent strength. During the dinner, Arthur was pulled into a conversation with the local magistrate at the far end of the table. Elara was left sitting next to Lady Harrington, a sharp-featured woman known for her cruel gossip. "We were all so shocked by the Duke's sudden engagement," Lady Harrington said loudly, ensuring the surrounding guests could hear. She took a slow sip of her wine, especially to a woman from London. "Tell me, Miss Vance, is it true what they say? That your father died in absolute disgrace, leaving you penniless? I even heard a dreadful rumor that your uncle was planning to send you to a medical facility for your fragile mind." The long table fell completely silent. Elara froze. The cruel words felt like a physical blow. The old panic gripped her chest tightly. She looked down at her plate, unable to find her voice, feeling the humiliating weight of a dozen staring eyes. "You are gravely misinformed, Lady Harrington." Arthur's deep, commanding voice cut through the silence like a sharp blade. He stood up from his chair and walked slowly around the table to stand directly behind Elara. He placed his hands gently but firmly on her shoulders. "Miss Vance comes from a highly respected family," Arthur continued, his tone cold and unyielding. "Her father was a man of great honor, a quality that seems to be entirely lacking at this table tonight. Any rumors regarding her health or her family are vicious lies spread by desperate men, and I will not tolerate anyone repeating them." He looked directly at Lady Harrington, his gray eyes flashing with a dangerous authority. "Elara is my chosen bride. Insulting her is a direct insult to the Pendelton name. I trust this will never happen again." Lady Harrington turned perfectly pale and quickly looked down, completely humiliated. No one dared to speak another word against Elara. Arthur gently offered his hand to Elara. She took it, and he helped her rise from her chair. "We will be taking our leave now," Arthur announced to the quiet room. He guided Elara out of the dining hall with complete dignity, protecting her from any further harm. The carriage ride back to Pendelton Manor was very quiet. Elara stared out the window into the dark night, a heavy knot of guilt forming in her stomach. Because of her, Arthur had insulted powerful neighbors. Because of her past, his perfect reputation was now surrounded by ugly whispers. She felt she was ruining the quiet life he had worked so hard to build. When they arrived at the manor, Elara did not go inside immediately. She walked away from the grand doors and stepped into the shadowy gardens, letting the cool night air calm her racing mind. She wrapped her emerald cloak tightly around herself, fighting back tears. A few moments later, she heard the steady crunch of footsteps on the gravel path. Arthur appeared beside her, his tall figure a comforting shadow in the moonlight. "You should not be out here in the cold," he said gently. "I am so sorry, Arthur," Elara whispered, finally looking up at him. It was the first time she had ever used his Christian name. "I have caused a terrible scene. Your neighbors will talk about this for months. My past is a heavy burden, and it is entirely unfair for you to carry it." Arthur stepped closer, his expression softening completely. He reached out and gently took her hands in his thumbs brushing across her knuckles. "Elara, look at me," he commanded softly. She lifted her tearful eyes to meet his. "You are not a burden. Defending your dignity tonight was not a duty. It was an absolute honor." Elara searched his face, looking for any sign of regret, but she found only steady, unwavering support. "But your reputation," she started to say. "My reputation means absolutely nothing if I cannot protect the woman I care about," Arthur interrupted quietly. The space between them seemed to vanish. Elara looked at his strong hands holding hers, realizing that the walls they had both built were finally crumbling. The marriage might have started as a strict legal contract, a desperate lie to keep her safe from her uncle. But standing in the moonlit garden, surrounded by his quiet strength and unconditional respect, Elara knew the truth had changed. The feelings growing between them were entirely, beautifully real. She did not want to be anywhere else in the world, as long as she was by his side. Heavy black clouds rolled over the Yorkshire moors, swallowing the fading sunlight. The wind howled against the thick stone walls of Pendelton Manor, sounding like a wild animal trying to break inside. Inside the grand library, Elara sat near the fireplace, trying to focus on a book, but the violent sounds of the storm made her deeply uneasy. As the evening wore on, the storm grew worse. Suddenly, a massive crack of thunder shook the old house. The violent vibration knocked a heavy iron window latch loose. The tall window blew open, letting in a furious gust of freezing rain. In an instant, the sudden draft blew out all the candles and oil lamps in the room. Total, suffocating darkness fell over the library. Elara gasped, dropping her book. She tried to stand, but another loud clap of thunder echoed through the room. In that absolute blackness, her mind violently betrayed her. She was no longer a safe guest in Yorkshire. She was back in the cold, damp townhouse in London. She could almost hear her uncle's cruel voice, turning the heavy metal key in the lock. When she had refused to obey him in the past, he had locked her in the windowless cellar for hours, leaving her entirely alone in the terrifying dark. The old panic gripped her chest tightly. Her breathing became fast and shallow. She stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a bookshelf, and slid down to the cold wooden floor. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her hands, trapped in the nightmare of her memories. Down the hall, Arthur was inspecting the manor to ensure the windows were properly secured. When he saw the library door completely dark, he frowned. He held his brass lantern higher and walked into the room. The wind was rushing through the open window, scattering papers across the floor, but Arthur did not look at the mess. His eyes immediately found Elara. She was curled into a small ball in the corner, trembling violently. She was taking sharp, desperate breaths, completely lost in a panic attack. Arthur set his lantern on the desk and quickly forced the heavy window shut, locking out the raging wind. He turned back to Elara. Seeing her so terrified broke his heart completely. The formidable, intimidating Duke disappeared in that moment. He did not call for the servants or stand above her with formal authority. Instead, Arthur dropped to his knees on the hard floor right in front of her. "Elara," he said softly, his deep voice cutting through the sounds of the storm. She flinched, pressing herself harder against the bookshelf. "Please," she whispered brokenly, her mind still trapped in London. "Do not lock the door, please." Arthur moved closer, his movements slow and incredibly gentle. He reached out and carefully covered her shaking hands with his warm, strong ones. "Elara, listen to my voice," he commanded gently. "You are not there. You are at Pendelton Manor. You are with me. No one will ever lock you away. I swear it to you." He kept speaking in a low, steady rhythm, anchoring her to the present moment. Slowly, the warmth of his hands and the absolute certainty in his voice began to pierce through her panic. Elara took a deep, shaky breath and finally raised her head. The golden light of the lantern illuminated Arthur's face. He was looking at her with such profound care that it took her breath away. "I am sorry," she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "The dark. It reminds me of my uncle's punishments. I felt like I was back in that terrible house." Arthur did not let go of her hands. He sat fully on the floor beside her, leaning his broad shoulders against the bookshelf. "You never have to apologize for the scars you carry, Elara," he said quietly. He looked down at their joined hands, his thumb gently tracing her skin. For a long time, he just sat there in the quiet golden light, sharing the space with her. Then Arthur took a deep breath. "I know what it means to be trapped in the dark," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not a physical room, but a prison of circumstances." Elara looked at him, surprised by his sudden vulnerability. "What do you mean?" "Everyone sees the power and the wealth of this title," Arthur continued, his eyes reflecting a deep, old pain. "But they do not see the cost. Years ago, my younger brother betrayed the crown. He was foolish, led by dangerous men. When I discovered his treason, I had to cover his tracks to save our family from complete ruin. I sent him far away, and I stayed here to carry the lie alone." Elara listened in silent awe. The severe, isolated man society feared was actually a man who had sacrificed his own peace to save his family. "I built a wall around myself to hide the secret," Arthur said, finally looking into her eyes. "I accepted a life of absolute loneliness because I thought I did not deserve anything else. I was completely in the dark, Elara, until the night I found you at my gates." Tears filled Elara's eyes again, but this time they were tears of deep understanding. She reached up and gently touched his cheek. Her fingers brushed against his skin, offering the same silent comfort he had just given her. Arthur leaned into her touch, closing his eyes for a brief second. The storm outside began to fade, the thunder rolling away into the distance. But inside the library, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The distance between them was gone. Arthur opened his eyes, looking at her with a quiet, burning reverence. He slowly brought his face closer to hers, giving her every opportunity to pull away. Elara did not pull away. She closed the final distance, pressing her lips against his. It was a gentle, deeply emotional kiss. It was not rushed or demanding. It was a profound promise of safety, respect, and late love. Arthur's hands moved to her waist, drawing her closer, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. Elara rested her hands on his chest, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart. When they finally parted, Arthur rested his forehead against hers. They were still sitting on the floor of the library, surrounded by the shadows, but Elara had never felt so entirely surrounded by light. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of cedar and rain on his coat. She felt a profound, unwavering security. Her uncle, Lord Silas, the debts and the threats, all felt 1,000,000 miles away. In the strong, protective arms of the Duke, Elara truly believed that her painful past was finally over, and that nothing could ever tear them apart. The morning sun cast a bright, hopeful glow over Pendelton Manor. For the first time in many years, the grand, quiet house felt entirely full of warmth and life. Arthur stood in the massive entryway, dressed in a heavy, dark traveling coat. He was leaving for the city of York for 2 days to meet with his most trusted lawyers. His singular goal was to legally secure Elara's stolen inheritance and permanently destroy her uncle's false guardianship. Elara stood before him, adjusting the thick collar of his coat with gentle, caring hands. She looked up into his gray eyes, seeing nothing but absolute dedication and profound respect. "I will return as quickly as the roads allow," Arthur said, his deep voice soft and reassuring. He took both of her hands in his and pressed a warm, lingering kiss to her knuckles. "When I come back, you will be a completely free woman. Your past will never haunt you again. We will finally build our life together without any shadows." Elara smiled, her heart swelling with a deep, consuming love. "Travel safely, Arthur. I will be waiting for you right here." She stood on the stone steps and watched his dark carriage disappear down the long gravel driveway. She wrapped her arms around herself, feeling a beautiful, comforting sense of security. She truly believed the terrifying storms of her life were finally over and that a peaceful future was entirely within her reach. The next afternoon, the weather on the moors was unusually mild. Elara decided to take a quiet walk near the outer edge of the estate gardens, wrapped warmly in the beautiful emerald cloak Arthur had given her. The crisp air smelled of pine trees and damp earth. She walked slowly along the stone boundary wall, imagining the future. She thought about managing the estate charities, organizing the library, and waking up every day beside the man who had saved her life. But as she reached the heavy iron gates near the southern woods, a dark, unmarked carriage suddenly rolled out from the deep shadows of the trees. The horses stopped, blocking her path entirely. The carriage door opened. Elara stopped breathing. Her uncle stepped out onto the muddy road. He was not accompanied by local constables this time, nor did he look furious. Instead, he wore a calm, deeply victorious smile that chilled Elara to the very bone. "Good afternoon, my dear niece," he said smoothly, taking a slow, confident step toward her. Elara immediately stepped backward, her heart racing wildly against her ribs. "You are trespassing on private lands. The Duke will have you arrested for this." "The Duke is currently in York," her uncle replied, his eyes gleaming with malicious triumph. "And by the time he returns, he will be in no position to arrest anyone. In fact, he will be completely ruined." Elara tried to turn and run back to the safety of the manor, but her uncle's next words stopped her entirely in her tracks. "I know everything about his brother's treason against the crown." Elara froze. The warm blood drained entirely from her face. She turned back to look at him, her mind frantically praying he was simply bluffing. But her uncle reached inside his heavy wool coat and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "I hired very thorough men to investigate the noble Duke Pendelton," her uncle explained, clearly enjoying the absolute terror growing in her eyes. "We bribed a clerk at the Royal Postal Office and searched an old, forgotten property the family still owns in London. We found original letters, concrete, undeniable proof that the Duke's younger brother conspired against the king and that the great Duke Arthur covered up the crime." Elara felt the ground swaying dangerously beneath her feet. She remembered the deep, haunting pain in Arthur's eyes when he had shared his dark secret with her during the storm. He had trusted her with his greatest vulnerability, and now that very secret was being used as a weapon to destroy him. "If I hand these original letters to the Parliament," her uncle continued, his voice dangerously low and steady, "Arthur Pendelton will be stripped of his grand title immediately. This massive estate will be seized by the crown. He will be thrown into a damp, cold prison cell for treasonous conspiracy, and his proud family name will be erased from society forever." "What do you want?" Elara whispered. Her voice was trembling with absolute dread, barely louder than the northern wind. Her uncle smiled coldly, putting the envelope back into his coat. "I want you in this carriage. Tonight you will return to London with me quietly, and tomorrow morning you will marry Lord Silas as we originally planned. He has agreed to wait. If you do this, I will personally burn these letters in the fireplace. The Duke's dangerous secret will remain safe forever, but if you refuse, or if you try to tell him the truth, I will send these documents to the Chief Magistrate tonight." Elara stared at the dark carriage. The choice placed before her was a living nightmare. She could refuse the blackmail, stay in the warm, safe arms of the man she loved, and watch him lose his freedom, his home, and his honor, because he had tried to protect her. Or she could sacrifice her own life, returning to a world of misery and fear with a cruel monster, just to ensure Arthur remained entirely safe and untouched. It was not a choice at all. It was a brutal, agonizing, but absolutely necessary sacrifice. "I will need an hour," Elara said. Her voice was completely hollow, emptied of all hope and emotion. "To pack my things." Her uncle nodded slowly, looking deeply satisfied. "I will wait for you exactly here. Do not try anything foolish, Elara. The Duke's life is entirely in your hands." Elara walked back to the Grand Manor like a ghost. She did not feel the biting cold of the wind. She did not hear the servants greeting her in the halls. Her shattered mind was focused on a single, impossible task. She went straight to her sunny room and pulled out her old, worn travel bag. She packed only the simple, plain clothes she had arrived in months ago. She carefully took off the beautiful emerald cloak, smoothing the soft velvet lining with trembling hands, and laid it gently on the center of the bed. She could not take his gifts. She could not take his love. She sat at the small wooden writing desk. She needed to write a letter of goodbye. It had to be perfectly convincing. It had to be cold and cruel enough that Arthur would be disgusted, so he would not come looking for her. If he pursued her and challenged her uncle, the letters would be released. She had to make him believe she was leaving by her own selfish choice. Her hands shook violently as she dipped the heavy metal pen into the ink. She wrote that she could no longer endure the quiet, isolated, and boring life on the dark moors. She lied with every word, stating that she missed the excitement of the city, and that upon further reflection, the vast wealth of Lord Silas offered a much more comfortable future than hiding as a false fiancée in Yorkshire. She forced her hand to write that she was grateful for his basic hospitality, but that she had never truly loved him. A single heavy tear fell onto the thick paper, smudging the dark ink near her signature. She quickly wiped her eyes, terrified the tear would reveal her desperate lie. She folded the letter carefully and placed it on the desk. Every single word she had written tore her heart into absolute pieces. When the heavy darkness of night finally fell, Elara slipped quietly out the back doors of Pendelton Manor. She carried nothing but her small bag and her old dark woolen shawl, wrapping it tightly around her chest once more. She walked through the cold shadows toward the southern gate, where the carriage was waiting. Before she stepped inside, Elara stopped. She turned around and looked back at the glowing windows of the grand stone house one last time. She whispered a silent, tearful goodbye to the only man who had ever made her feel safe, completely sacrificing her own freedom so that he could keep his. Arthur returned to Pendelton Manor 2 days later. His lawyers in York had successfully discovered the legal path to restore Elara's stolen inheritance. He walked through the grand doors, eager to share the wonderful news. But the vast house felt strangely empty. Mrs. Higgins, the housekeeper, hurried into the hall. She handed Arthur a folded piece of paper, her hands trembling. "She left, Your Grace, in the middle of the night." Arthur walked quickly into his private study. He stood by the window and unfolded the paper. She claimed she was bored of the moors. She claimed she preferred the immense wealth of Lord Silas. She claimed she had never truly cared for him. Any other man might have been entirely crushed. But Arthur knew Elara's true essence. He looked much closer at the paper. The handwriting was uneven, the letters shaky. Near her signature, the ink was smudged by a single dried tear. Arthur crushed the letter in his hand. She had not left him by choice. She had been brutally forced to leave. Arthur immediately walked out to the southern gate. He knelt in the mud and found the deep tracks of a heavy carriage heading south toward London. Why would she leave willingly in the dead of night? What terrible leverage could her uncle possibly use? Then, a sudden realization hit him. 2 weeks ago, his London solicitor mentioned that an old, abandoned property owned by the Pendelton family had been broken into. The old family vault had been heavily disturbed. The dark truth became perfectly clear. Her uncle had found the old letters proving Arthur's brother had committed treason. He was using Arthur's dark past to blackmail Elara. She had sacrificed herself, walking directly back into a living nightmare, solely to protect him and his reputation from absolute ruin. Arthur looked down at the silver signet ring on his hand. For his entire adult life, he had protected his family name above all else. But standing in the cold rain, he realized his grand title and flawless reputation meant absolutely nothing if he lost the woman he loved. He ordered his fastest horse to be saddled immediately. He was ready to burn his own perfect world to the ground if it meant saving hers. The journey south to London was a blur of relentless speed. When Arthur arrived in the city, he went directly to the highest legal authority, the chief magistrate of the crown. Arthur demanded an immediate audience. He placed a locked leather box on the magistrate's desk. Inside the box was the absolute truth about his brother's treason. Years ago, when Arthur discovered the conspiracy, he had not simply covered it up. He had secretly reported the plot directly to the king to prevent a terrible conflict, sending his brother away in permanent exile. For his profound loyalty, the king had granted Arthur a confidential royal pardon. The secret was buried to protect the crown, not the Pendelton name. The blackmail documents her uncle possessed were legally worthless. Arthur quickly explained the cruel extortion taking place. Outraged by the uncle's financial frauds and the attempted blackmail of a loyal duke, the magistrate immediately signed the necessary warrants. In the oppressive townhouse, Elara stood perfectly still in front of a tall mirror. She was dressed in a restrictive wedding gown of pale gray silk. Her hazel eyes were empty, drained of all the beautiful light she had found in Yorkshire. Downstairs, she could hear Lord Silas arriving. Her uncle knocked sharply on her bedroom door, telling her it was time to sign her life away. Elara closed her eyes, clutching her dark woolen shawl tightly. She whispered a silent prayer for Arthur. Suddenly, a massive crash shook the front doors of the house. Heavy, disciplined footsteps flooded the downstairs hallway. Elara stepped out to the top of the stairs, her heart pounding. Her uncle and Lord Silas were standing in the main hall, completely surrounded by uniformed officers of Scotland Yard, and standing in the very center of the room, looking like a fierce, unstoppable force of nature, was Arthur. Her uncle pulled out the blackmail letters, shouting frantic threats about ruining the Duke forever. "Publish them," Arthur stated loudly, his deep voice carrying absolute authority. "Give them to the press. I do not care. They are completely worthless." Arthur signaled to the lead inspector, who stepped forward holding the royal pardon and the arrest warrants. "You are under arrest for severe financial fraud and the attempted extortion of a duke," the inspector announced firmly. Her uncle turned completely white. The officers quickly placed him and Lord Silas in heavy iron cuffs, dragging the protesting men out the front door and into the busy street. The dark house suddenly fell completely silent. Arthur looked up and saw Elara standing at the top of the stairs, trembling with disbelief. He walked up the wooden stairs quickly, closing the distance between them. When he reached her, Arthur did not demand an explanation for her letter. Instead, this powerful, deeply feared man slowly dropped to one knee right in front of her. He gently took her shaking hands in his own. "You were willing to endure a lifetime of misery just to protect my name," Arthur whispered, his gray eyes shining with overwhelming emotion. "But my name means absolutely nothing without you, Elara. I would gladly lose my title, my lands, and my reputation 1,000 times over, just to ensure you are safe." Elara dropped to her knees beside him, tears of profound relief pouring down her pale face. The crushing weight of her sacrifice was finally lifted. She threw her arms around his strong neck, holding on to him as if he were her entire world. And as Arthur wrapped his arms securely around her, holding her tightly against his chest, she knew with absolute certainty that the nightmare was truly over. With her uncle safely behind heavy iron bars, the dark clouds that had followed Elara for years finally cleared entirely. The royal magistrate acted swiftly to correct the terrible injustice. The hidden will of her late father was quickly recovered from her uncle's secret files in London. Elara's rightful inheritance, which was far larger than she had ever imagined, was fully restored to her name. She was no longer a helpless captive or a penniless refugee running for her life. She was an independent, wealthy woman, completely free from the terrifying threats of her past. Lord Silas and her uncle faced long, hard years in a cold prison cell, paying the heavy legal price for their cruelty and greed. A week later, Elara and Arthur returned together to the sweeping moors of Yorkshire. As their carriage rolled through the massive iron gates of Pendelton Manor, Elara did not feel the lingering fear and exhaustion she had felt on her first arrival in the storm. Instead, she felt a profound, overwhelming sense of coming home. The grand stone house no longer looked intimidating or lonely. It looked strong, warm, and entirely welcoming. That evening they stood together in the quiet warmth of his private study. A bright fire crackled in the wide stone hearth, casting a soft, golden light across the room. Arthur turned to face her. His expression was serious, but his gray eyes were filled with a deep, unmistakable gentleness. "The legal danger is completely gone," Arthur said quietly, taking a slow step closer to her. "You are officially a free woman, Elara. You have your own wealth and your own complete independence. The false engagement that bound us together is no longer necessary to keep you safe from harm. You are absolutely free to travel, to buy a beautiful home in the city, or to live wherever your heart truly desires." Elara looked up into his striking face. She remembered the long, lonely years of her youth, and the terrifying journey through the freezing rain. She smiled softly, her heart beating with a pure, undeniable love. "My heart does not desire a grand house in the city," she whispered, taking a small, brave step toward him. "It desires the home I have already found right here." Arthur let out a slow, shaky breath. He reached down to his right hand and slowly removed the heavy silver signet ring. It was the absolute symbol of his immense power, his family duty, and the solitary life he had forced himself to live for so long. He gently took Elara's left hand and placed the ring carefully into her palm, closing her delicate fingers around the warm metal. "I do not want to be your legal protector anymore," Arthur said, his voice thick with raw, beautiful emotion. "I want to be your true partner. I want to share my life, my lands, and my entire heart with you. I am asking you to stay, Elara, not out of fear or necessity, but out of love. Will you marry me, truly and completely?" Tears of absolute joy filled her hazel eyes. She did not hesitate for a single second. "Yes," she answered, her voice breaking beautifully. "Yes, Arthur, with all of my heart." Arthur wrapped his strong arms around her waist, lifting her slightly off the soft rug as he kissed her deeply. It was a kiss of pure freedom, a beautiful promise that their lonely days were permanently behind them. 6 months later, Pendelton Manor was completely transformed. The heavy, dark curtains were pulled back in every room, allowing the bright morning sunlight to flood the grand halls. The quiet, isolated house was now filled with warm laughter and joyful activity. Elara had taken over the estate's massive charity projects, using her own restored wealth to build a comfortable school for the children of the local tenant farmers. Arthur no longer carried the severe, intimidating posture that society had feared. He smiled often, and he never turned his ring in anxiety anymore. Elara no longer wore her dark, worn shawl as a shield. She walked through the grand halls with total grace, wearing bright colors and a permanent, radiant smile. Late one afternoon, Arthur and Elara stood together on the wide stone terrace, looking out over the beautiful, sweeping moors. The air was crisp and fresh. Arthur wrapped his arms securely around her from behind, resting his chin gently on her shoulder. Elara leaned back against his strong, warm chest, completely at peace. She covered his hands with hers, feeling the solid weight of her own gold wedding band. They had both survived terrible storms and deep darkness, but as they watched the golden sun set over their peaceful lands, they knew their true life had finally begun.